Want to bring in our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, who has also been listening in to the Prime Minister. Rosemary, there was a lot there. He covered a lot of ground. A number of things stood out to me, but I'm very interested to hear what stood out to you.
Yeah, I mean, these are very familiar themes for anyone that listened to the Prime Minister through the election campaign. But there are a couple of things that did stand out for me. First of all, really painting a picture of the moment that Canada is in, faced with, of course, the trade war by the United States and a relationship that has changed fundamentally. Also saying that Canada can no longer be a country that relies on one trading partner. So that need to diversify that he has talked about before. And then some of the ways he went through some of the things that the government has already put in motion to try and deal with that. Recognizing there are, of course, sectoral tariffs, and that still has to happen. But whether it be investment in housing or the defense industry or other measures that they will be taking, you hinted at some there in the budget. That was sort of the part about how the strategy is working now. He did also say, I should say, that he is setting an ambitious goal for Canada to double non-U.S. exports in the next decade. To give you a sense of how dramatically he wants to change our dependence on the United States, he's now put a target on it, which is pretty interesting. But the vast majority of the message, I think, really came at the end of the speech, when that was about preparing Canadians. That's why this speech was happening, not just to remind you of what his government has done, but to prepare you for what is to come. He did recognize that while inflation has come down, that the cost of living is still too high. He also recognized that in spite of some of the challenges he laid out, the economy is still holding up. But he said that is why Canada needs to act now to make some changes. And then he went on, and this is an important part, I think, Sarah, to say that he would be straight about the challenges we are facing, saying that the economy cannot be transformed overnight, and indeed that's sort of the political reality that he might be faced with, and that sacrifices will be needed and that they are going to take time. The sacrifices there that we're talking about will come, I think, in cuts, and what Canada, and this was something he alluded to as well, what Canada will have to live with less of, even though it might be something that the country wants to do. To me, those were sort of the key messages were at the end. You know, trying to reassure Canadians of the things the government is working on the strength of the Canadian economy. He believes the ongoing strength of the Canadian economy, because certainly there's lots of signs of a slowing and weakening economy, and then the reality of some of the things that are going to have to be done, whether that come in the form of cuts to public services and to the public sector, or in the kind of transformation that he's talking about that is not going to happen quickly, and that Canadians will have to be a little bit patient with how the government moves forward. There was nothing, earth-shattering in here. I should also say that. So I think that's why when we're talking about it, it is really about laying the groundwork for Canadians to start thinking about a budget that is going to be perhaps very different than what they've seen over the past decade, certainly.
Can I ask you, the other thing that stuck out to me when he was talking about the deficit, and we were talking about this before the speech, we don't know what that deficit is going to be.
Right.
There are projections that are out there, but he also did say, I felt like it was a promise that that deficit would be balanced in 3 years, and the way to do that was by reducing government spending and streamlining government. And then he went on to make a very sort of specific example of how they are already in that process, talking about the choices made, responsible choices, he called them, about Canada Post. And I immediately imagined if I'm a Canada Post worker and how, when we talk about, he sort of alluded to the, there could be some pain, the sacrifices that will need to be made, right. How that really sits with those who are experiencing it maybe already.
Yeah, it's important to realize that when he's talking about balancing the deficit, he's actually only talking about a portion of the deficit. He's talking about the operating deficit, which he says is going to happen over 3 years. So that will be done by either getting rid of jobs in the public service, attrition in the public service, or potentially a loss of services. The capital investment budget, because this is the way the government has now will now be dividing up the budget, is where you're going to see the big spending, because that's the place where they are hoping to invest in order to grow. So the deficit will not be, I wouldn't think, balanced on that edge of the side of the ledger in 3 years, if we are talking about a magnitude of what we've been saying, between 65 to $100 billion in deficit. So that's the first piece there. But you're right that he does sort of lay out some of the places where he believes that there are already efficiencies to come. Canada Post still in a labor dispute, but that would be one of them, as a need to change the way that Crown Corporation operates. But that's also where he made that line. He says, even with such efficiencies and better management, we will have to do less of some of the things we want to do so we can do more of what we must do to build a bigger, better Canada. And I guess my question as a Canadian would be, okay, but how long do I have to live with less in order to get to the promise that you are putting on the table? And how will that help me in the immediate? And I would imagine that is, sort of what the opposition parties will seize on as well. For people who don't have a job right now, particularly a lot of young Canadians, and for people who are struggling to buy groceries, this is a promise of change in the future, not immediate relief. Of course, there was a tax cut that was made before the summer started, but that didn't affect everybody in the same way. So how is this promise going to affect people immediately? And I think the answer is it's not. You're going to have to wait to see the long-term payoff, that this will result in a stronger economy, a growing economy, and eventually higher wages, but with sacrifices that will have to be made until we get to that point, if it works.
Rosemary, invaluable to have you here listening along with all of that insight. I really appreciate it. CBC News Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton, thank you. Okay, I now want to bring back Chantal Jovellanos. She is a first-year university student at the University of Toronto. And Chantal, we of course spoke to you in the lead up to this, and you talked about the struggle that you and your colleagues, your fellow students, face in terms of the challenges, affordability for sure, housing another, and cost of living, trying to have an enjoyable, balanced life as a university student, while at the same time hopefully working a job because you need to. Of course, there aren't that many jobs to be found. I think that sums up our earlier conversation. What I'd like to know now is, in listening to that speech, what did you hear, and was it what you hoped to hear?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was definitely a combination of things. On one hand, I am glad that he really addressed how a lot of students are dealing with a lot of issues, like considering the contrast of inflation and also the cost of living. There was a lot of talk of promises on housing and affordability, which were the things that I previously discussed. But I think on the other hand, too, I think it's really concerning to also hear about the possible cuts that could be happening. And even though he did talk about transparency, there still is a lot of questions on what that would even entail in terms of our day-to-day lives. And even for students like me who, like you mentioned, are looking for jobs, who want jobs, like right now, we want to move out right now. We want to get money right now. And if these are things that are going to happen in the long term, are these really things that are going to be beneficial in my life in the next coming years?
I have time for one more question, Chantal, so I want to ask you. And one of the things he said is, it's your future, and we're going to give it back to you. In talking about military spending, he made the connection to the jobs that could potentially come of that, and saying, giving an example of an engineer student in Ottawa having a great career in Canada, talking about how it's going to be a great time to be in the trades. As a student, and I don't know what program you're in, but do you think young people listening to that, it sort of shapes decisions that they might be making, knowing where the government might be going?
I think it's definitely something that people, especially young people, are considering right now, is where the industry is going. I mean, if there's a lot of focus on like military efforts and trade efforts, I definitely see a lot of people going in that direction. But for a lot of people especially, that's not really what we want per se. What we want is jobs that aren't so focused on the military, aren't so focused on the US. People want jobs that can benefit their lives in their own particular way. And I do appreciate that there is some jobs that are coming from this, but I do think that that does raise a lot of questions about how this will go long term, because people don't want to just go and deal with those kinds of issues.
Chantal Jovalanos, first-year university student at the University of Toronto. It was great to have you speaking with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's talk a little more about the economy and what this might signal. Pedro Antunes is a chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada and joins me now. Pedro, it's good to have you on the show. I assume you were also listening to what Mark Carney had to say there. Did today's speech reveal to you things you maybe didn't know about the budget, what more to expect come November 4th?
Well, I don't think there was a whole lot new. I think there's a few messages that we keep hearing about. I didn't hear a lot about productivity and enticing private investment and competing with the U.S. and the challenges that we have with the U.S. changes in their own tax regimes, corporate tax in particular. So I'm a little concerned about how much that the budget will, in the end, deal with this kind of productivity issue that we've been struggling with in Canada for years now.
Rosemary did point out his talk about trade deals and negotiations with countries outside of the United States, saying that he wants to double non-U.S. exports in the next decade. So putting a timeline on it. What did you make of that? I'm going to call it a promise.
Well, I think there's opportunity here. I think most of our trade has been directly with the U.S. because it's such a big economy. We have the same languages. We had an open border for all of these years. But we also have opportunity here with a lot of trade deals with a lot of other countries, including the European Union, South Korea. I think it was mentioned in Indonesia as well. So these are growth markets. These are markets where we don't have a lot of, we don't export an awful lot to. And so we can take advantage of that. It will be very, very difficult, though, to move quickly and to move enough so that we're not feeling the impact of our challenges with the U.S. economy, essentially. So we still do need to settle on some trade deal here with the U.S. That's really important.
Did you feel in that speech that you heard, he talked about sacrifices, difficult choices that'll have to be made in order to allow for spending, bold moves, is how he was describing it. And there are some, it does sound like there's going to be some significant spending, which leads me to the question of the deficit, because a lot has been said about a number that we don't know at the moment, but talk that it could be much higher than perhaps someone like yourself might feel comfortable with. What are you anticipating, and how are you going to feel come November 4th about deficit?
Yeah, I do think there's a claim to be made here for investing in productive assets that will drive future growth. It's kind of called the golden rule. If you're investing in things that are going to drive future growth, then it's fair, intergenerationally fair, and you're not just consuming at the expense of future generations. So I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. I do worry about the challenges, though. We keep saying that, we're the best in the G7, best among many OECD countries in terms of our fiscal situation, but we're comparing ourselves to a lot of countries that are in trouble. So the bottom line will be, are we going to be able to manage the debt financing costs, which are already more than doubled where they were just a few years ago? And to me, the real question here is both deficits, both on the current and on the capital account, are going to feed the cost of financing that debt, and that's really important.
Pedro Antunes is a chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Thanks so much for that.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Okay, once again, we've got Mark Marison here. He's watched the speech. We talked a couple of times in the lead up to that speech. I had made many notes here. What stood out to you?
What was really interesting to me was what a difference it is to have Mark Carney as the Prime Minister than Trudeau being the Prime Minister. What I was thinking about when I was listening to what he was talking about, I was thinking about what Trudeau did and what his legacy was. And you think about all the social programs that he improved. He had his hands full with COVID, and he legalized pot. But those are probably the big highlights for a lot of people. What Mark Carney's talking about is building. He's talking about building homes, and governments haven't been building homes since the 1980s. Like, this has been a huge backlog, huge problem for Canadians, and it's got to start happening now. It should have happened years ago. He's talking about building defense, and he's talking about building infrastructure, and he's got this major projects office, which is going to be talking about building all kinds of different projects around the country that build the economy. These are things that don't happen overnight, but they're all things that I think have slipped. And to think that there's going to be a big deficit is because this money is going to be going into capital spending. It's not going to be going into program spending like it did in the previous election. In the previous government the same way.
Speaking of the Trudeau government, he also talked about immigration and saying that they are going to, I think the words he used were bring it under control and make sure that basically there are programs to support the people who are coming to Canada and make sure they are they're the people with the skills that Canada needs. That is a difference, certainly. And I don't think it's the first time we've heard that messaging from him, but to your point about differences between his predecessor and himself, that seems to be at least one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think about how he communicated with the young people who were in the room? I mean, he started off with a sort of a light moment, talking about his own university experience.
No, that was all interesting, but I do think that one of the problems that he's been having is that he's been traveling the world doing all of this work, and it hasn't been since the election that he's had a substantive sort of marker down about what his vision is and what is that he's actually accomplishing. So this was a good backdrop for him, but this wasn't just meant for the students. This was meant for all Canadians, and he's getting people prepared for the fact that he's got a very ambitious agenda that in the short term might cost something, but in the long term we're going to have a lot of benefits. Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll all be watching November 4th, perhaps speaking to you again come November 4th, but thanks for being in studio with us to walk us through it all. Appreciate it. That is Mark Marison, former Liberal National Campaign co-chair and principal at Burrard Strategy. Thank you.